The year 2025 has brought gold prices to levels that would have seemed fantastical just a decade ago. At over $4,000 per ounce, gold trades at heights that dwarf its previous peaks, and whispers circulate through financial markets about something bigger brewing beneath the surface, a potential return to monetary systems long thought dead and buried. The question on everyone's mind: is President Trump planning to bring back the gold standard? And if so, could it happen as soon as 2027? Let me tell you something. After 40 years of studying monetary history, the patterns repeat, but never quite the way people expect them to. Every generation thinks they've discovered the formula for permanent prosperity, and every generation learns the hard way that there's no such thing. What makes this moment particularly fascinating isn't whether Trump actually has a secret plan locked away in some Mar-a-Lago safe. It's that we've reached a point where such speculation doesn't immediately get laughed out of serious financial circles. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about reversing a decision made by Richard Nixon over 50 years ago, one that fundamentally transformed how money itself works. And yet, when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stood beside Trump in February 2025 and cryptically mentioned monetizing the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet for the American people, gold bugs and conspiracy theorists weren't the only ones taking notice. Major hedge funds started gaming out scenarios. Bloomberg ran serious analysis. The Financial Times devoted column inches to speculation about gold revaluation. This wasn't fringe anymore. But here's where we need to separate the wheat from the chaff, because in monetary history, what people believe is happening often matters as much as what's actually happening. And right now, belief is running wild. The gold standard, for those who've forgotten their economic history or slept through it in college, represents something elegantly simple that becomes devastatingly complex in practice. Your currency is worth a fixed amount of gold. That's it. No central bank manipulations, no quantitative easing, no sophisticated monetary policy responses to economic shocks. Just gold. Paper money becomes nothing more than a convenient stand-in for the actual metal sitting in vaults somewhere, theoretically available for redemption at the fixed price. For over a century, this system governed the world's major economies with iron discipline. It imposed a harsh accountability that modern policymakers would find absolutely intolerable. Can't balance your budget? Too bad you can't just print more money to cover the gap. Economy sliding into recession? You better hope gold flows in from somewhere, because your money supply is tethered to that yellow metal whether you like it or not. Want to fund a war or implement sweeping social programs? Get ready to raise taxes or cut spending elsewhere, because monetary financing isn't on the menu. Nixon killed this system on a Sunday evening in August 1971, interrupting regularly scheduled programming to announce that America would no longer exchange dollars for gold at the official rate. The decision came after a desperate weekend at Camp David, where 15 advisors, including the Federal Reserve Chairman, worked frantically to craft a response to a looming crisis. Foreign central banks, led by France, had figured out the game was rigged and were demanding their gold. America's reserves were hemorrhaging. Inflation was rising, unemployment was climbing, something had to give. What gave was the last vestige of gold backing for the world's reserve currency. And in that moment, though few recognized it at the time, the world entered uncharted monetary waters. For the first time in human history, all major currencies floated free of any commodity anchor whatsoever. Money became purely a matter of trust. Trust in governments, trust in central banks, trust that those managing the printing presses would exercise restraint. You can probably guess how that worked out. Since 1971, the dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power. The Federal Reserve's own stated policy is 2% inflation annually, which sounds innocuous until you realize that means your money loses half its value every 35 years by design. The national debt has exploded from under $400 billion when Nixon closed the gold window to over $36 trillion today, a figure so large it's become almost meaningless. We measure it in percentages of GDP now because the absolute numbers break our brains. Enter Donald Trump, a man who's never met an economic orthodoxy he didn't want to challenge. During his first term, he surrounded himself with monetary policy advisors who made mainstream economists nervous. Judy Shelton, who Trump nominated to the Federal Reserve Board, had openly questioned whether the Fed should even exist and written favorably about gold-backed currency. Steve Bannon, his former chief strategist, went on podcasts declaring that Trump could ditch the Federal Reserve entirely and restore the gold standard. These weren't coded messages, they were saying it out loud. Trump himself expressed admiration for the gold standard in interviews, calling it wonderful, and suggesting America was more stable when money had real backing. For a sitting president to speak this way about monetary policy represented something genuinely unusual. Modern presidents typically defer to Fed independence and speak in careful platitudes about supporting the central bank's dual mandate. Trump had no such inhibitions. Yet his first term passed without any concrete moves toward gold-backed currency. The Fed continued operating as it always had. The dollar remained purely fiat. Markets kept functioning on the same fundamental assumptions they'd operated under since the 1970 seconds. It seemed like just another Trump talking point that generated headlines but led nowhere. Then came his second term, and things got interesting. In March 2023, 3 Republican congressmen introduced legislation that would literally restore the gold standard. The bill wasn't some symbolic gesture or messaging document. It laid out a detailed implementation plan. 24 months to prepare. Full disclosure of all U.S. gold holdings and transactions since 1971. Federal Reserve banks required to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price determined by market rates on the implementation date. It was serious policy work, even if everyone knew it had zero chance of passing. The bill died in committee without a vote, which surprised exactly no one. But its mere existence signaled something. Gold standard advocacy had moved from the fringes into the realm of actual legislation introduced by sitting members of Congress. The Overton window on monetary policy had shifted. Fast forward to February 2025. Trump signs an executive order creating a sovereign wealth fund, and Secretary Bessent makes his cryptic comment about monetizing U.S. assets. Immediately, market participants start connecting dots. The United States holds over 8,000 metric tons of gold in its reserves. On the government's books, this gold is valued at $42.22 per ounce, a statutory price set in 1973 that nobody's bothered updating. Meanwhile, market prices for gold have soared past $4,000 per ounce. Do the math. The accounting value of U.S. gold reserves sits around $11 billion. The market value exceeds $700 billion. That's a $689 billion gap between book value and reality. One simple accounting adjustment revaluing gold to market prices could theoretically inject this amount into Treasury coffers overnight. Speculation exploded. Was this Bessent's plan? Was Trump about to pull off an accounting maneuver reminiscent of what FDR did in 1934 when he revalued gold from about $20 per ounce to $35, instantly expanding the government's balance sheet? It would be elegant, in a way. No congressional approval needed for a bookkeeping entry. Suddenly, the government has access to hundreds of billions in fresh revenue without raising taxes or cutting spending. The deficit picture improves on paper. Markets might even applaud the creativity. But Bessent quickly doused the speculation. In a Bloomberg interview just weeks later, he flatly stated that gold revaluation wasn't what he had in mind when talking about monetizing assets. All the gold remains safely stored. No plans to visit Fort Knox. No grand accounting schemes in the works. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. Is there actually a plan to restore the gold standard by 2027 or anywhere close to that time frame? The honest answer, based on everything verifiable, no. There is no documented Trump administration policy, no Treasury Department initiative, no Federal Reserve program, and no serious congressional legislation actively working toward gold standard restoration by 2027 or any specific date. What exists is speculation, advocacy from certain circles, occasional supportive comments from Trump and his allies, and a general sense that monetary policy orthodoxies are up for debate in ways they haven't been for decades. But, and this is where it gets interesting, the absence of a concrete plan doesn't mean the underlying forces driving speculation have disappeared. If anything, they've intensified. Gold prices tell the story. They've surged over 60% year over year, reaching levels that suggest investors worldwide are hedging against something. Central banks, particularly in emerging markets, are buying gold at rates not seen in modern history. China, Russia, Turkey, they're accumulating reserves as fast as they can, clearly preparing for a world where the dollar's dominance might not be guaranteed forever. Even Western central banks, which sold gold aggressively in the 1992 and early 2000s, have reversed course. The narrative around Federal Reserve independence has deteriorated dramatically. Trump openly pressures Fed Chairman Powell to cut interest rates, calls him an enemy, and has made clear his intention to replace Powell before his term expires. Markets watch nervously, remembering the 1970 seconds when political interference in monetary policy helped generate the worst peacetime inflation in American history. When presidents start treating the central bank as a political tool rather than an independent institution, gold becomes more attractive as a hedge. Meanwhile, the structural problems that gold standard advocates point to have only grown worse. Federal debt exceeds $36 trillion. Deficits run over $1 trillion annually, even during economic expansions. The Fed's balance sheet, bloated by years of quantitative easing, sits at levels that would have been inconceivable before the 2008 crisis. Social Security and Medicare face funding shortfalls that dwarf current debt levels. The math, quite simply, doesn't work under current policies. Mainstream economists argue these problems don't require and wouldn't benefit from a gold standard restoration. In fact, they contend it would make things catastrophically worse. Survey economists and an overwhelming majority reject gold-backed currency as a solution to modern economic challenges. The academic consensus is nearly unanimous. The gold standard helped deepen the Great Depression by preventing monetary authorities from responding effectively to banking crises and demand collapses. The economic logic is straightforward. Modern economies require flexibility to respond to shocks. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, the Fed could slash interest rates, implement emergency lending programs, and purchase trillions in assets to prevent complete systemic collapse. None of this would have been possible under a gold standard. When COVID shut down the global economy in 2020, governments could deploy massive fiscal stimulus while central banks ensured adequate liquidity. Under gold constraints, the recession would have been far more severe and prolonged. There's also the practical problem of gold supply. The U.S. money supply, even measuring it narrowly, vastly exceeds the value of federal gold reserves. Full convertibility would require either massive monetary contraction, which would trigger a depression making the 1,930 seconds look mild, or gold revaluation to prices so high they dwarf current market levels. Neither option is politically feasible or economically sensible. Yet the appeal of gold persists, and for understandable reasons. Regular Americans who've watched their grocery bills double, their purchasing power erode, and their savings accounts yield negative real returns after inflation understand intuitively that something is broken. They might not grasp the intricacies of monetary policy or the trade-offs between different currency regimes, but they know their dollars buy less every year while the government assures them inflation is under control. The gold standard offers a seductive simplicity. Tie money to something real, something governments can't just print into existence, something with intrinsic limits. It promises to restore discipline, prevent monetary manipulation, and protect savers from the invisible tax of inflation. These aren't unreasonable desires. History provides both ammunition and caution for gold advocates. During the classical gold standard era, before World War I, economic growth was indeed robust. America transformed from an agricultural backwater into the world's largest industrial power while operating under gold's constraints. Price stability was remarkable over long periods, with inflation and deflation alternating but averaging out to relatively stable purchasing power across decades. But this same era also featured banking panics, regular financial crises, and brutal recessions that threw millions out of work with no safety net. The gold standard's discipline cut both ways. It prevented reckless monetary expansion but also prevented helpful monetary expansion during downturns. Economies experienced violent boom-bust cycles. Farmers and debtors suffered under deflationary pressures while creditors prospered. The distribution of economic pain was far from even. The interwar period demonstrated gold standard failures even more starkly. Britain returned to gold at an overvalued rate after World War I, strangling its export industries and contributing to a decade of economic stagnation. When the Great Depression struck, countries that abandoned gold earlier recovered faster. Those that clung to the system longest suffered most severely. The lesson seemed clear. Whatever the gold standard's virtues during calmer times, it becomes a straitjacket during crises. Modern gold standard proposals try to address these historical failures through modifications, adjustable pegs, gold price targets instead of fixed rates, cooperative international arrangements. But each modification moves further from pure gold standard principles and reintroduces the discretionary policy that gold backing was supposed to eliminate. You end up with something that isn't quite a gold standard, but isn't quite free-floating fiat currency either, arguably the worst of both worlds. There's also the international dimension that makes unilateral restoration virtually impossible. The IMF's Articles of Agreement prohibit member nations from pegging currencies to gold, while the U.S. could theoretically withdraw from the IMF or negotiate changes to these articles. Doing so would require international cooperation on a scale that seems politically implausible. Every major economy would need to agree to fundamental monetary system changes simultaneously, or face massive capital flows and currency instability as arbitrageurs exploited differences between systems. The dollar's reserve currency status depends partly on its liquidity and flexibility characteristics that gold backing would constrain. Foreign central banks hold dollars precisely because they can be deployed quickly and easily for any purpose. Lock dollars to gold with convertibility requirements, and suddenly those reserves become less useful. Central banks might accelerate diversification away from dollars, the very outcome gold standard advocates claim they want to prevent. Trump could take some unilateral actions using executive authority. He could establish a commission to study monetary reform, similar to Reagan's Gold Commission in 1981. He could direct the Treasury to use the Exchange Stabilization Fund to engage in gold operations, potentially setting an unofficial gold price target without formal convertibility. He could continue pressuring the Fed through public comments and strategic appointments. None of these would constitute an actual gold standard restoration, but they could shift the monetary policy discourse. What seems clear is that we've entered a period of monetary policy uncertainty unlike anything since the 1970 seconds. The post-Bretton Woods consensus independent central banks targeting low inflation through interest rate management, floating exchange rates, and activist monetary policy during crises faces challenges it hasn't confronted in decades. Not just from gold standard advocates, but from cryptocurrency enthusiasts, modern monetary theory progressives, and populists across the political spectrum who question whether current arrangements serve ordinary people's interests. Gold's surge to over $4,000 per ounce reflects this uncertainty. Investors aren't necessarily betting on gold standard restoration. They're hedging against a broader set of monetary and geopolitical risks, debt sustainability concerns, currency devaluation fears, geopolitical fragmentation, inflation volatility, and political instability. Gold serves as portfolio insurance in an era where the insurance seems increasingly necessary. The hidden 2027 reset narrative should be understood in this context not as revealed truth about secret government plans, but as crystallized anxiety about monetary system stability. People sense something unsustainable about current trajectories. Debt growing faster than GDP, central banks trapped between inflation risks and financial stability concerns, political polarization making fiscal reforms nearly impossible, and geopolitical rivals actively working to undermine dollar dominance. Whether Trump has a specific plan or not, the conditions that make people susceptible to such narratives are real and intensifying. When Treasury secretaries make cryptic comments about monetizing assets, when gold prices reach record highs, when central banks worldwide accumulate reserves at historic rates, when presidential candidates openly question Fed independence, these aren't signs of a healthy, stable monetary system confident in its foundations. The gold standard isn't coming back in 2027, almost certainly not in 2030 either. The political, economic, and technical obstacles are too substantial. But that doesn't mean the monetary system remains static. Change happens gradually, then suddenly. Currencies that seemed eternal have collapsed. Systems that appeared permanent have dissolved. Monetary arrangements reflect power relationships, economic realities, and political choices, all of which are in flux. What Americans should watch isn't whether Trump unveils a secret gold standard plan, but rather the underlying indicators of monetary system health: debt trajectories, inflation stability, Fed independence, dollar reserve currency status, and international monetary cooperation. These fundamentals determine whether the current system endures or eventually gives way to something different, whether that's a modified gold standard, a digital currency regime, a multipolar reserve system, or something nobody has yet imagined. After 4 decades studying these patterns, I've learned that monetary systems change when the old arrangements no longer serve the interests of those with power to change them. Right now, the system still works for enough powerful actors to maintain its basic structure. But the stresses are building, the contradictions are mounting, and the political will to make hard choices seems absent. Something, eventually, we'll have to give. Whether that happens in 2027 or 2047, whether it involves gold or something else entirely, whether it comes as planned reform or chaotic crisis, those questions remain open. What's certain is that we live in interesting times, and monetary history suggests interesting times rarely end the way anyone expects.